We are traveling back to a time that witnessed the birth of one of the greatest political and social experiments in history. The year is 1925. Russia, as we knew it, is gone. It has been reborn from the ashes of a vast Tsarist empire under a fierce new ideology, now known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. This is the immediate aftermath of a colossal upheaval. The country is reeling from the devastation of 4 years of World War I, the shock of the twin revolutions of 1917, and the brutal, fratricidal civil war, 1917-1922. Millions have perished, the economy lies shattered, and the old order has been utterly liquidated. In 1925, while the wounds of the revolution are being bandaged, this new communist state is desperately struggling to define its identity, rebuild its economy, and map out its future. Its founding leader, Vladimir Lenin, passed away just a year prior, and the vacuum he left has ignited a ferocious power struggle at the heart of the Bolshevik Party. So, what was Russia like 100 years ago? How did the traditions of Tsarist Russia merge, or clash, with the stern dictates of the Communist Party? What was life truly like in the cities and villages? This video will guide you through the political, economic, and daily life labyrinth of the 1925 Soviet Union. Let us take a closer look at the turbulent yet exciting years of transition from empire to socialism. The year 1925 was defined by the structural reality of the USSR, founded in late 1922. The new nation was, in theory, a federation of Soviet republics, but in practice, all political power flowed not from these republics, but from a single centralized entity, the Communist Party, formerly the Bolsheviks. The central dogma was the dictatorship of the proletariat, but in reality, it was the dictatorship of the party leadership. The previous year, 1924, had seen the death of the charismatic founder, Vladimir Lenin. His body was embalmed and put on display, turning him into a secular saint, a powerful symbol to legitimize the new regime. However, his death left a massive political void, and his personal testament, which warned against the growing power of Joseph Stalin, was suppressed by the very people it sought to protect. The internal battle for control of the party, and thus the entire state, was reaching a fever pitch. On one side stood the left opposition, led by the brilliant but arrogant Leon Trotsky, who advocated for permanent revolution, the urgent need to spread communism globally, and immediate, rapid industrialization at home. On the other side was a triumvirate: Stalin, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev. This initial alliance was forged purely out of a shared desire to neutralize Trotsky. Stalin, who held the unassuming but crucial post of General Secretary, was masterful at using the party apparatus. While others debated ideology in grand halls, Stalin quietly appointed his loyalists to key provincial posts, securing control over the bureaucratic machine. By 1925, the dynamic had shifted. Having marginalized Trotsky, Stalin abruptly turned on his former allies, Zinoviev and Kamenev, forcing them into a newly formed, desperate alliance with Trotsky, the united opposition. Stalin skillfully used the party's fear of factionalism, Lenin's ban on internal organized opposition, to silence his critics. Stalin's rising power was cemented by his championing of the rival doctrine: socialism in one country. This pragmatic, isolationist-sounding policy appealed to a war-weary party establishment eager to focus on rebuilding Russia rather than funding endless foreign revolutions. By 1925, while still sharing power, Stalin was rapidly tightening his grip, transforming the party into his personal tool of authority. Behind the scenes, the security apparatus was already in full swing. The notorious Cheka had been replaced by the OGPU, Joint State Political Directorate, an organization designed to maintain control not just against counter-revolutionaries, but against the party's own internal critics. Though the mass purges of the 1930s were still on the horizon, the political atmosphere was one of increasing suspicion, forced conformity, and the chilling realization that dissent was no longer tolerated. The ideological framework was set, and the dictator was preparing to take his final seat. The political struggle was raging, but the true battle in 1925 was against hunger and economic ruin. The preceding period, known as War Communism, 1918-1921, had been a disaster. The forceful requisitioning of grain, the nationalization of nearly all industry, and the suppression of private trade resulted in widespread famine, peasant revolts, and a catastrophic drop in production. By 1921, agricultural output had fallen to half of pre-war levels. Vladimir Lenin, realizing that an economic collapse would doom the communist experiment, reluctantly introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP, in 1921. By 1925, NEP was in full bloom and was the defining feature of daily economic life. It was a calculated temporary step back toward capitalism, described by Lenin as one step backward, two steps forward. The most immediate and profound change was in the countryside. The hated grain requisitioning was replaced by a fixed tax in kind, allowing peasants to keep and sell their surplus produce on the open market. This small allowance for profit instantly stabilized the food supply. In the cities, small-scale private enterprises, factories employing fewer than 20 people, and private shops were denationalized and allowed to operate. This pragmatic shift brought rapid economic recovery. By 1925, industrial output was approaching pre-war standards, and agricultural production had largely stabilized. Moscow and Petrograd, now Leningrad, saw the return of lively street markets, small restaurants, and thriving workshops. This period gave rise to a new, controversial class known as the Nepmen. These private traders, speculators, and small-scale industrialists accumulated wealth rapidly, operating small businesses that ranged from textiles to bakeries. They drove fancy cars and wore stylish clothes, creating a visible capitalist contrast to the surrounding poverty and official communist austerity. They were the economic engine of the NEP, yet they were ideologically despised by the party, who viewed them as class enemies to be tolerated only until the socialist economy was strong enough to stand alone. The existence of Nepmen highlighted the internal contradictions of 1925. The state controlled the commanding heights, heavy industry, banking, and foreign trade, but the base, the essential daily commerce and agriculture, relied on private initiative. Within the party, the right opposition, led by figures like Nikolai Bukharin, passionately defended the NEP, arguing that socialism should be built slowly, allowing the peasants to enrich themselves. However, Stalin and the hardliners viewed NEP as a humiliating necessity that had already served its purpose. They saw the Nepmen as a corrosive force and the reliance on private peasant farming as a threat to ideological purity. This tension between economic reality and ideological zeal was the silent fuse of the Soviet future. The vibrant yet ideologically compromised NEP was living on borrowed time. To truly understand 1925, we must look beyond the Kremlin walls and into the lives of ordinary Soviet citizens. This was a country of profound dualities, where the future was being built upon the foundations of a deeply rooted past. The vast countryside. The majority of the Soviet population, nearly 80%, still lived in rural areas. Here, life revolved around the seasons, albeit now under the supervision of local Soviets, councils. Thanks to the NEP, the villages were seeing a limited return to prosperity. The peasant now had a direct incentive to produce. However, the rural landscape was fractured. The rise of the kulaks, literally fists, meaning well-off peasants who employed labor or owned better equipment, created deep class divisions. The party viewed the kulaks with suspicion, seeing them as nascent capitalists who must eventually be liquidated as a class. This ideological hostility, even during the NEP's relative tolerance, hung like a storm cloud over the successful farmer. While most farming remained individual, the party began its first, cautious steps towards collectivization. Kolkhozes, collective farms, and sovkhozes, state farms, were established, but in 1925 they were still largely isolated experiments, holding only a tiny fraction of the farmland, mainly serving as ideological models for the ideal socialist future. The crowded cities. In the urban centers, the shift was dramatically visible. The greatest immediate challenge was housing. Old Tsarist mansions and bourgeois apartment buildings were immediately nationalized and redistributed. This created the infamous Kommunalka, or communal apartment. Entire families lived in a single room, sharing a kitchen and bathroom with several other families. Privacy was non-existent. Every daily annoyance, every political argument, and every small triumph was public. This communal living environment was ideological, forcing workers and former bourgeois families into close, constant contact, fostering both solidarity and friction. The social revolution. The Communist Party actively sought to dismantle the traditional social structures of the old regime. Education was a major priority. The Lickbez, Elimination of Illiteracy campaign used mass mobilization, reaching millions of illiterate adults and making huge strides in raising literacy rates across the country. The goal was to equip the masses not just to read, but to read and understand Marxist ideology. Furthermore, the party pushed revolutionary changes to family law. Divorce was made incredibly easy, often attainable by postcard. Abortion was legalized, making the Soviet Union the first major nation in the world to do so. And women were legally guaranteed equality in the workplace and education. The ideal was the new Soviet woman, free from domestic slavery and fully integrated into the economic and political life of the state. A cultural explosion. The 1920s were a breathtaking period of cultural experimentation. Since the party had not yet imposed absolute artistic orthodoxy, Soviet art was dominated by avant-garde movements. Constructivism in design and architecture, championed by figures like Alexander Rodchenko and L. Lissitzky, sought to create functional, purposeful art that served the proletariat and the revolution. In literature and poetry, voices like Vladimir Mayakovsky blended powerful futurism with revolutionary fervor. This was art as propaganda, but it was often brilliant, reflecting the raw energy and idealism of the early years. The assault on faith. The final piece of the transformation was the aggressive campaign against religion. The Russian Orthodox Church, once a bedrock of the Tsarist power, was subjected to relentless persecution. Church property was seized, priests were harassed, and religious instruction was banned. The state promoted militant atheism, replacing icons with portraits of Lenin and the hammer and sickle, attempting to eradicate the spiritual habits of centuries and establish a purely secular, materialistic worldview. In 1925, the Soviet Union was not just a state, it was an ideological fortress dedicated to a world-altering vision. The state's very foundation rested upon Marxism-Leninism, which promised the inevitable end of capitalism and the dawn of a global, classless, communist society. This was the gospel, and the party's role was to be its infallible interpreter and executor. Propaganda was the air that the citizens of the USSR breathed. It was an essential, pervasive tool used to construct the new Soviet man-woman, an idealized citizen free from bourgeois vices and dedicated entirely to the collective. Posters, films, radio broadcasts, and mass rallies constantly hammered home the virtues of labor, scientific advancement, and loyalty to the party. Culture itself was militarized. The prolet cult, proletarian culture movement sought to replace all existing art forms with creations entirely rooted in the working class experience. The Soviet Union viewed itself as the vanguard of the world proletariat. For Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolution was never meant to be a standalone event. It was simply the first domino. The ultimate goal remained the world revolution. The primary tool for this global ambition was the Comintern, Communist International, headquartered in Moscow. Established in 1919, the Comintern was an international association of communist parties from around the globe. In 1925, its mandate was clear: to coordinate and fund revolutionary activity in every corner of the world, from Germany and China to Latin America. Its very existence created intense hostility between the Soviet state and the capitalist powers, leading to a foreign policy of cautious diplomacy mixed with relentless ideological aggression. However, the reality on the ground was disappointing. The expected revolutions in industrialized Western Europe had failed. This disappointment fed directly into the internal party struggle. As we noted, Leon Trotsky continued to push for immediate, costly support for the world revolution, his permanent revolution theory. In contrast, Joseph Stalin's ascent was inextricably linked to his pragmatic counter-slogan, socialism in one country. Stalin argued that since global revolution had stalled, the USSR must focus its resources inwards, building a powerful, self-sufficient socialist state that could serve as a beacon and base for future revolutions. This policy resonated deeply with the nationalistic and weary sentiments of the party bureaucracy, providing an excuse to focus on internal consolidation and centralizing power under his control. Simultaneously, the Soviet state was tackling the legacy of the former empire's vast ethnic diversity. The USSR was ostensibly a union of equal republics, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia being the initial members. The party actively promoted national in form, socialist in content policies, encouraging local languages and cultures to flourish, but only within the strict ideological bounds of Soviet socialism. This was a calculated strategy to win over non-Russian populations, many of whom had fought against the Bolsheviks in the Civil War. However, this policy also carried the latent threat of great Russian chauvinism, which would later be used to crush national aspirations. In 1925, the USSR was a massive contradiction, a desperate, recovering state striving for peace while simultaneously planning for global war, a nation championing national self-determination while centralizing absolute power in Moscow. This dual focus defined the Soviet identity and laid the groundwork for the rigid, totalitarian future that lay just around the corner. Even as the Bolsheviks furiously sought to erase the past, the shadow of the Russian Empire lingered in 1925. The new Soviet state was built on the old infrastructure, inheriting its railways, its sprawling urban centers like Moscow and Leningrad, and, most critically, its deep-seated bureaucratic traditions. Paradoxically, the very revolution that promised to eliminate the ruling class often recycled elements of it. Many former Tsarist officials, military experts, and engineers, dubbed bourgeois specialists, were desperately needed to keep the country running. These specialists were viewed with distrust but were paid highly and given privileges, creating a subtle internal class tension within the supposedly classless society. They were necessary but ideologically suspect. Furthermore, the scale of the state itself demanded a massive centralized administrative structure. The promise of grassroots power through the local Soviets often clashed with the reality of the highly centralized party control. The resulting state apparatus was often slow, inefficient, and prone to the very bureaucratic inertia that communism claimed to despise, a feature often satirized in the arts of the time. Beyond the inherited structure, 1925 saw the subtle yet irreversible laying of groundwork for the Second Revolution, the radical transformation of the economy under Stalin. The temporary NEP was rapidly fulfilling its function of basic repair, and the party leadership increasingly believed that genuine socialism, the total elimination of private ownership, required two things: rapid, massive industrialization, and the collectivization of agriculture. Though the first five-year plan was still a few years away, the first clear signals were being sent. Industrial production goals were gradually rising, and state rhetoric against the Nepmen and the kulaks was becoming sharper. Discussions within the party focused on where to find the capital for the immense industrial effort required to catch up with the West. The consensus was emerging. The resources would have to be squeezed from the countryside, from the very peasants who had been temporarily placated by the NEP. Figures like Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, an economist associated with the left opposition, articulated the theory of primitive socialist accumulation. This theory essentially argued that the Soviet state must exploit the private peasant sector, through high prices for industrial goods and low prices for grain, to fund the rapid creation of heavy industry. Though Preobrazhensky was ultimately defeated by Stalin, the logic of his plan was ruthlessly adopted by Stalin just a few years later. Thus, 1925 was not just a pause, it was a pivot point. The relative freedom of the NEP markets, the lively avant-garde art, and the cautious national policy were all set to be abruptly reversed. The stage was being quietly set for the forced collectivization, the breakneck pace of the five-year plans, and the full consolidation of a brutal personal dictatorship. The vibrant, contradictory world of the mid-20s was the calm before the storm. We have journeyed through the complex landscape of the Soviet Union in 1925. This was a land caught between two worlds, the ghost of the Tsarist Empire and the demanding vision of a socialist utopia. The defining characteristic of this year was contradiction. We saw an economy thriving under the quasi-capitalist NEP, yet simultaneously undermined by the ideological zealots who despised the very success of the Nepmen. We witnessed a cultural explosion of avant-garde artists who celebrated the revolution, unaware that a rigid, state-controlled artistic doctrine, socialist realism, was soon to crush their creativity. And we observed political power, theoretically distributed among the Soviets, being rapidly consolidated by one quiet, ambitious man, Joseph Stalin. But 1925 was the crucial midpoint. The period of chaotic revolutionary warfare was over, and the era of the devastating Second Revolution, the forced collectivization, and the rapid, often brutal, implementation of the five-year plans had not yet begun. It was a window of relative freedom and potential. Yet, beneath the surface, the essential machinery of a totalitarian state was being assembled. The security apparatus was being refined, political dissent was being codified as treason, and the ideological groundwork for extracting resources from the population was complete. The story of Russia 100 years ago is the story of a brief moment of breath before a profound, world-altering transformation. The seeds of both great tragedy and unprecedented industrial achievement were planted in the fertile but increasingly controlled soil of the young Soviet state.